He hadn't experienced the touch of another soul into decades. Not a firm handshake from a neighbor, not a reassuring clap on the back from an old friend, not even the fleeting graze of hands during a transaction at the general store. Elias Thorne had crafted his existence around isolation, around the fortress of seclusion that shielded him from the world's cruelties. But when that young woman showed up at his property line one crisp morning, requesting permission to tend to his dairy herd, the foundations of his carefully erected barriers started to fracture. The morning light was just cresting the distant hills when Elias first noticed her approaching along the rutted dirt road leading to his spread. A girl in her late teens, with chestnut hair pulled into a practical braid and a faded calico dress that spoke of hard times and harder work. She strode with determination, yet Elias could detect the undercurrent of urgency in her repeated glances back toward the highway, as if she were debating whether to turn tail and flee. Eleanor paused at the boundary fence, her fingers curling tightly around the weathered split rail. From his vantage on the front stoop, Elias observed her steeling herself, her posture straightening as she readied her words. It had been for years since anyone had ventured onto his land. The previous intruder had been a land speculator, and that encounter had concluded with harsh words and the ominous click of a rifle's hammer. Her voice rang out across the yard, clear and resolute despite the distance. She was seeking employment, she explained. Her pa was laid low with tuberculosis ravaging his body, and her ma was stretched thin minding for little ones. Word around town was that Elias kept milk cows, and she wondered if he could use an extra hand with the chores. A pang stirred in Elias's gut, a sensation he believed had long since withered away. The young woman remained there, expectant of a response, and in that instant, he saw her vitality, unpolished beauty of prairie grass swaying in the breeze, resilient and untamed. It unnerved him more profoundly than any blizzard or predator he'd faced on these acres. His thoughts drifted to Rebecca, to vows shattered and an existence cut tragically short, to the remorse that had exiled him to this remote corner where pain couldn't penetrate, because nothing could approach. The figure at his perimeter embodied all he'd vowed to shun: optimism, intimacy, the specter of heartbreak. Yet there was a tenacity in Eleanor's bearing that echoed Rebecca's unyielding spirit. When she'd defied her kin to build a life with him, the recollection struck like a mule's kick, leaving him winded. Eleanor called out once more, her tone gentler now, laced with doubt. She must have perceived his internal turmoil, the battle raging in his gaze. Most folks would have backed off by then, recognizing the hallmarks of a recluse who craved solitude. But she held her ground. She clung to that fence, awaiting a verdict that could alter their paths irrevocably. And Elias comprehended that after 20 years evading human bonds, one had at last tracked him down. The dilemma was whether he possessed the fortitude to welcome it, or if the dread that had preserved him would sabotage this unforeseen opportunity. Elias advanced toward the barrier with deliberate steps, akin to nearing a skittish colt. Each footfall betrayed the principles he'd upheld to repel the outside world. But an element in Eleanor's quiet plea had pierced his armor, and now he stood near enough to discern the faint creases of concern etching her youthful features. She elaborated on her plight with unvarnished candor born of desperation. Her father had been a robust farmer until the disease gripped his chest. Now he struggled to rise from his sick bed, and their meager reserves were depleting like snow in spring thaw. She'd trekked 15 miles from the nearest settlement to plead for this shot. As she spoke, Elias's eyes fixed on her hands. They bore the marks of labor, but retained a softness, the sort adept at handling delicate matters. Rebecca had possessed such hands capable of soothing a frightened lamb, or nursing a wounded bird back to health. The parallel constricted his throat. He informed Eleanor that he required no assistance, that he handled the milking adequately solo. Yet even as he uttered the refusal, he sensed her skepticism. She'd likely spotted the telltale neglect, the encroaching thistles near the outbuildings, the sagging wire on the pens, the overall aura of a man teetering on the edge of overwhelm. Eleanor didn't contest his denial. Instead, she inquired if she might at least inspect the livestock, claiming familiarity with dairy operations and a desire to assess their condition. It was an odd proposition, but her earnest inflection prompted him to assent before reason intervened. They proceeded to the shed side by side, preserving a respectful gap. Elias noted her gait vigilant yet composed. She posed queries about the strain of cattle, his tenure in ranching, his market for the milk. Straightforward inquiries, but each unveiled her genuine expertise in the trade. Upon entering the structure, Eleanor's demeanor shifted. She perceived what Elias had concealed, the animal's tension, the dip in yield from improper management, not due to malice on his part, but to decades of shunning tenderness had eroded his capacity for gentle care. She voiced no reproach, but her quietude conveyed much. She stroked one cow's side, and the beast relaxed in a manner that evoked poignant familiarity in Elias. This woman had the gift, an innate rapport with creatures mirroring Rebecca's talent. Eleanor pivoted to confront him. For a beat, they merely regarded one another in the subdued illumination of the barn. Elias detected the unspoken query in her stare, her deliberation on whether to advance or withdraw. He grasped she was extending one final opening for him to choose wisely. But wisdom seemed elusive. Permitting her presence signified jeopardizing his safeguards. It entailed exposing himself to departure, to bereavement. It demanded recalling the essence of concern for another's welfare. Nevertheless, observing Eleanor amid his herd, Elias started to fathom that certain hazards merited pursuit. The quandary was if 20 years of apprehension could yield to a singular spark of promise. The hush lingered until Eleanor took initiative for them both. She approached the initial cow, murmuring reassurances as she inspected the udder. Elias observed, mesmerized, as she exhibited a compassion he'd presumed extinct. She noted the onset of inflammation in one animalculable promptly, but perilous if neglected. Her commentary held no censure, solely pragmatic regard for the creature's needs. She progressed to subsequent beasts, and with each evaluation, Elias sensed his fortifications eroding. Upon completing her review, Eleanor faced him with a blend of compassion and resolve. She refrained from reiterating her plea. Rather, she proposed a trial, 1 week of unpaid labor to demonstrate her value. If dissatisfied, she'd depart permanently. The suggestion landed like a gut punch. Instinct urged rejection, expulsion before she entrenched further. Yet a dormant facet whispered that this might salvage both him and his operation. He acquiesced involuntarily. Eleanor's countenance brightened with alleviation and appreciation, affording Elias a peek at the delight she once harbored before hardship dimmed it. The vision stirred a latent shift within him. They devoted the remainder of the forenoon to outlining procedures. Eleanor would commence at daybreak for the initial session, allowing Elias to address other tasks. She'd reappear at dusk for the follow-up, departing prior to nightfall. A sensible setup minimizing interaction while optimizing aid. Yet amid their planning, Elias caught himself noting inconsequential traits. The crinkles framing Eleanor's eyes during a grin, her inadvertent humming during labor, her mindful navigation of his personal space. As midday peaked, Eleanor readied for departure. She'd fulfill her vow at first light, she assured, validating his choice. Elias monitored her retreat along the trail, her form diminishing until obscured by the rise. For the initial instance in eons, his ranch's quietude oppressed rather than soothed. The herd appeared agitated absent Eleanor's serenity, and Elias pondered the morrow with anticipation absent for 20 years. He rationalized it as mere commerce, Eleanor a mere laborer for chores. But inwardly, he acknowledged a profound alteration. After 20 years solitary, companionship had infiltrated, and that prospect daunted him beyond prior trials. Sunrise arrived swifter than anticipated, or perhaps Elias had lingered awake longer. The night had seen him traversing his dwelling, grappling with allowing Eleanor's return. Logic dictated a dismissal note at the boundary, revoking the pact. But as dawn tinted the skyline, he positioned himself on the veranda, scanning for her outline. He claimed mere curiosity regarding her reliability. Yet the surge of solace upon her emergence debunked the deception. Eleanor arrived bearing a modest pail, clad in yesterday's attire. She advanced confidently to the outbuilding, acknowledging him with a nod a la neno superfluous dialogue, no imposed rapport. She intuited the fragility of their accord and honored his limits. Elias observed remotely as she initiated the dawn routine. Her method was impeccable, tender yet proficient. The cows acquiesced promptly, adopting a tranquility absent from Elias's domain for ages. He recognized his livestock had mirrored his seclusion, and Eleanor's influence mended them alike. As the day advanced, Elias labored nearer the structure than customary. Not intrusively, but sufficiently to oversee, he maintained. Truth proved multifaceted. Her workflow entranced purposeful elegance, the murmurs pacifying beasts, the subtle smile when unobserved. It evoked eras when toil transcended subsistence, when stewardship embodied affection over obligation. Eleanor concluded the session and commenced sanitizing tools with equivalent diligence. Elias neared cautiously, uncertain of verbiage, but compelled to commend her efforts. She glanced up at his approach, halting her actions. They lingered thus, linked by exigency, yet divided by decades of weariness and grief. Then Eleanor smiled modestly, impacting Elias unexpectedly. She reported the herd's swift adaptation to steady, kind treatment. Output would surge shortly, and incipient ailments could resolve fully with vigilance. Her delivery merged expertise with authentic concern. Elias nodded, then inquired if she'd breakfasted. The query startled both, surfacing from obscured civility recalling solicitude for others. Eleanor denied, confessing pre-dawn departure to punctuality. No grievance, merely recognition of her commitments. Impulsively, Elias extended coffee and cornbread before her trek. The invitation escaped unchecked, eliciting Eleanor's widened gaze. She consented, and as they proceeded to his abode, Elias realized he'd transgressed a self-imposed threshold from 20 years past. The quandary was if this minor benevolence heralded recovery or precipitated fresh calamity. The interior seemed confined with company. Elias had acclimated to solitary echoes. Silence punctuated solely by creaking timbers and remote lowing. Eleanor's aura infused vitality, both reassuring and disconcerting. She perched gingerly at his crude oak table, hands clasped as she surveyed the austere quarters. Elias viewed his habitat anew, lone seat, Spartan cut against the plaster, utter dearth of homely touches. It bespoke a man subsisting, not thriving. While brewing coffee on the iron stove, Eleanor softly recounted her kin. Her pa had been formidable, tilling soil and mending machinery with unyielding vigor. Now confined, gazing listlessly from his pallet, remedies demanded fortunes beyond their means. Her narrative depicted veiled despair cloaked in resolve, for siblings requiring sustenance. And Garb, a ma frayed by anxiety and toil, Eleanor shouldering the load to sustain all. Elias contemplated duty, the essence of safeguarding dependence. Placing the mug before her, their digits brushed incidentally. The momentary contact jolted Elias, robbing breath. He retracted abruptly, spilling liquid across the grain. Eleanor regarded him with worry and perplexity. He muttered regrets, fetching a cloth to mop. But Eleanor's insightful gaze pierced, discerning his reclusion stemmed from profound scars. Contact, even innocuous, threatened. She refrained from probing, her features softening with empathy. She'd witnessed men fractured by frontier hardships, bereavement, unbearable loads. She intuited whatever propelled Elias to seclusion remained festering, despite elapsed time. The brew cooled amid circumspect quiet. Eleanor sensed conversational pressure would air, while Elias wrestled with novel urges to communicate, yet lacked facility. Social graces had decayed in isolation. Ultimately, Eleanor rose to depart, expressing thanks for hospitality and vowing evening return. Pausing at the threshold, she imparted words constricting Elias's chest emotionally. She observed he'd once been compassionate, remnants lingering beneath fortifications. No condescension, merely affirmation of his former self prior to life's cruelties instilling terror. Post-departure, Elias contemplated the paired mugs, pondering if 20 years' barriers might collapse via one woman's steadfast gentleness. Dusk descended with thunderheads amassing over the peaks, Elias monitoring the lane with unforeseen unease. Gusts intensified, bearing precipitation's aroma and tempest's vow. His fret was pragmatic. He insisted her lengthy return perilous in foul weather. Eleanor materialized as initial droplets plummeted, trusses lashing as she hastened to shelter. Elias observed from cover, admiring her resolve amid brewing gale. She grasped the imperative to complete chores pre-deluge. The stock fidgeted, detecting turmoil, but Eleanor's composure assuaged as she operated deftly. Elias overheard her placations above the howl, a balm against escalating fury. Completion coincided with torrential downpour, flashes rending heavens. Elias positioned at the portal, noting Eleanor's apprehensive survey of the maelstrom. The 15-mile hike risked lethality in obscurity. He vocalized unbidden, proffering refuge till abatement. The utterance felt alien, fraught with peril. Brief cabin proximity had challenged. Overnight cohabitation seemed insurmountable. Eleanor demurred, asserting safe transit. Familial duties beckoned sibling aid. Paternal vigilance. Obligation matched Elias's phobia and rigidity. A deafening boom rattled timbers, illumination stark from proximate bolt. Eleanor's recoil betrayed conflict between duty and survival. He urged vehemently, arguing familial benefit null if she perished en route. His timbre edged desperate, betraying emergent investment in her fate after mere days. Eleanor scrutinized his countenance in flickering glow. Perceiving insistence rooted deeper than utility, she conceded to delay till peak subsided, stipulating barn lodging over intrusion. The accord balanced feasibility and impossibility. Proximity with maintained separation demanded fortitude Elias doubted, yet permitting storm venture was inconceivable. Arranging hay bedding, Elias recalled a prior gale 20 years hence, another female requiring haven. The flashback bore guilt's crush, reaffirming isolation's rationale against attachment's hazards. Yet Eleanor nestled gratefully, and despite dread, Elias acknowledged some gambles warranted, even if forfeiture might shatter his remnant spirit. The gale howled as they slumbered fitfully, divided by scant distance and decades' barriers. Morning dawned hushed, fury expended nocturnally. Elias roused to Eleanor already attending stock in nascent radiance. She'd preserved discretion in shared confines, intuitively grasping trust's gradual erection. Observing unfiltered by fear, Elias noted Eleanor's assurance from lifelong caregiving. Yet beneath resilience lurked burden. Scarcely adult, she shouldered adult onuses. Post-milking, Eleanor confronted him with gratitude laced deeper. Thanks for sanctuary amid turmoil. Then she uttered transformative words. She comprehended his solitude, contact's peril, mirrored in her gaze post-diagnosist's terror of abrupt loss. Eleanor's insight demolished defenses. No repair attempt, merely pain's validation amid persistence. An audacious gesture rendering Elias speechless. First since Rebecca's passing, Elias narrated his ordeal. Words labored, but Eleanor attended sans critique as he detailed failing his beloved, her demise cementing affection's lethality. Eleanor eschewed platitudes, sharing paternal malady fears, familial prospects, solitary submersion sensation. Burdens shared lightened. As sunlight ascended, Elias decided astonishingly. Permanent employment with compensation, lodging if requisite. Essentially, alliance and mutual stewardship. Eleanor's assent manifested in tears relief, thankfulness, guarded hope unleashed. In Barnes' streaming beams, Elias realized seclusion protected yet imprisoned. Eleanor illuminated risk's value, connection surpassing void's surety despite lost potential. After 20 years essential contacts alone, Elias grasped healing via tenacious companionship refusing solitary confrontation. Eleanor hadn't merely sought cow-tending. She'd proffered life's reawakening. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm that Elias hadn't known. Since his early years on the ranch, Eleanor arrived each morning with the first hints of light, her footsteps light on the path as if she were mindful not to disturb the fragile peace they'd established. She tended to the cows with the same quiet efficiency, her hands moving with a practiced grace that spoke of years spent on similar chores back home. Elias found himself drawn to the barn more often than necessary, pretending to check on fences or tools while stealing glances at her work. It wasn't just the improvement in the herd's health that captivated him. Milk yields were already climbing. The animals calmer and more productive at the way Eleanor's presence seemed to infuse the entire ranch with a sense of purpose he'd long forgotten. One afternoon, as the sun hung high and the air shimmered with summer heat, Elias decided to tackle the overgrown field behind the barn. It had been years since he'd cleared it properly, the weeds choking out what could have been good pasture. He swung the scythe with mechanical determination, his muscles remembering the motion even if his mind resisted the effort. Sweat poured down his back, soaking his shirt, but he pushed on, driven by an unfamiliar urge to make the place presentable. Was it for the cows? For efficiency? Or was it, he wondered with a twinge of unease, for Eleanor? She noticed the work when she returned for the evening milking. Pausing at the edge of the field, she watched him for a moment before calling out a greeting. Elias straightened, wiping his brow with a sleeve, and felt a flush that had nothing to do with the exertion. She commented on the progress, her voice carrying genuine approval, and offered to help rake the cuttings into piles. He started to refuse. The old habits died hard, but something in her expectant gaze made him hand her a rake instead. They worked side by side as the sun dipped lower, the only sounds the scrape of tools against earth and the occasional low of a cow in the distance. It was during this shared labor that Eleanor opened up more about her life. Before the illness struck her family, her father had been a pillar in their small community. Not just a farmer, but a man who fixed neighbors' wagons without charge and organized barn raisings after storms. Her mother, a school teacher once, had given it up to raise the children, but still read to them every night. From tattered books of poetry and adventure tales, Eleanor spoke of her siblings with a mix of exasperation and fierce protectiveness. The eldest boy, who dreamed of becoming a doctor, the twins who got into endless mischief, and the baby sister who followed her everywhere like a shadow. As she talked, Elias felt the walls around his own memories cracking further. He hadn't spoken of Rebecca in detail since that morning in the barn, but now fragments escaped. How she'd loved dancing at county fairs, her laughter like wind chimes, the way she'd planned their future with unshakable optimism. The conversation turned deeper as they paused for water from the well. Eleanor asked gently about the ranch's history, and Elias found himself recounting how he'd claimed the land after the war, building the cabin with his own hands and Rebecca's encouragement. But he stopped short of the tragedy, the words catching in his throat like thorns. Eleanor didn't press. Instead, she shared a story of her own loss, a beloved aunt taken by fever when she was just a child, leaving a void that never quite filled. It was a moment of raw vulnerability, two souls acknowledging the scars life had inflicted without demanding explanations or solutions. As they resumed work, Elias realized this was what terrified him most, not the risk of loss, but the slow, inevitable pull toward caring again. That evening, after the milking was done and the field partially cleared, Eleanor lingered longer than usual. The sky was painted in hues of orange and purple, and crickets began their nightly chorus. She suggested they sit on the porch for a spell, and though every instinct screamed to retreat into solitude, Elias agreed. They shared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and fresh milk, his first shared supper in decades. Conversation flowed haltingly at first, but soon they were debating the best ways to predict weather patterns, laughing softly at tales of stubborn livestock, and even touching on dreams deferred. Eleanor confessed her secret wish to one day own a small plot of land where she could grow herbs and raise goats, free from the shadow of debt and illness. Elias, surprised by his own candor, admitted he'd once harbored ambitions of expanding the ranch into a thriving dairy operation, shipping milk to the growing towns nearby. But as the stars emerged, the mood shifted. Eleanor grew quiet, her eyes distant, and Elias sensed the weight of her worries returning. She spoke haltingly of a letter from home that morning, her father's condition worsening, the doctor's bills mounting like storm clouds. The family was on the brink, she said, and though her work here provided some relief, it wasn't enough. Elias felt a surge of protectiveness, an emotion he'd buried deep after Rebecca's passing. He offered to advance her wages, to send supplies home, but Eleanor shook her head with proud determination. She wouldn't accept charity, she insisted. She'd earn her way. The exchange left them both unsettled, highlighting the precarious balance of their budding connection. Elias fearing overstep, Eleanor guarding her independence amid desperation. The next morning brought tension. Eleanor arrived later than usual, her face pale and drawn, circles under her eyes speaking of a sleepless night. She dove into the chores without her customary hum, her movements efficient but mechanical. Elias watched from afar, debating whether to approach. When he finally did, offering coffee as a peace offering, she accepted, but remained subdued. Over the steaming cups, she revealed the source of her distress, a visit from the town constable the previous evening. Rumors were swirling about her working for the hermit on the hill, as folks called Elias. Some whispered he was dangerous, a man who'd driven away his own kin. Others pitied her, warning she might catch whatever curse had befallen his late wife. Eleanor dismissed the gossip, but Elias could see the hurt in her iced isolation of being caught between loyalty to her family and this new, fragile alliance. This revelation ignited a spark of anger in Elias long dormant. He hadn't cared about town opinions in years, but hearing how they tainted Eleanor's reputation stirred something fierce. He proposed accompanying her home one day, to show her family the ranch and prove his intentions were honorable. The idea shocked them both. Elias venturing off his land after 2 decades? Eleanor hesitated, weighing the risks, but eventually nodded. It would be a turning point, she said, a way to bridge the worlds they'd kept separate. As she left that day, Elias felt a mix of exhilaration and dread. Was he ready to face the outside world, with its judgments and memories? Or would this step unravel the careful life he'd rebuilt? The journey came sooner than expected. 2 days later, after a particularly productive morning where they bottled extra milk for sale, Eleanor suggested they go that afternoon. Her father's health had stabilized somewhat, but she needed to deliver earnings and check on the children. Elias prepared with trembling hands, saddling the horse and packing provisions like a soldier heading to battle. The ride down the dirt road felt eternal, each mile peeling away layers of his seclusion. Eleanor rode beside him on the wagon, pointing out wild berry bushes and sharing light stories to ease the tension. But as the farmhouse came into view, a modest structure, with smoke rising from the chimney's resolve wavered. What if they saw him as the broken man he believed himself to be? The reception was wary at first. Eleanor's mother, a woman with the same chestnut hair streaked with gray, greeted them at the door, her eyes narrowing at the stranger. The children peeked from behind her skirts, wide-eyed and curious. Inside, her father lay in bed, his coughs echoing through the room like thunder. Introductions were stiff, the family eyeing Elias as if he were a ghost from the hills. But Eleanor bridged the gap, explaining his kindness, the work, the stability he'd provided. Slowly, the ice broke. The mother offered tea. The children bombarded him with questions about ranch life. And even the father managed a weak handshake, his grip frail but grateful. As evening fell, Elias shared stories of frontier days, of taming the land with nothing but grit. He spoke haltingly of Rebecca, framing her as a woman of strength much like Eleanor, which drew nods of understanding. In return, the family opened up about their struggle-est failed crops, the relentless medical costs, the fear of losing their home. Elias felt a kinship in their pain, a mirror to his own losses. By night's end, he'd committed to more than just employment. He'd arranged for a doctor from town to visit, covering the fee anonymously through Eleanor. It was a gesture born of compassion, but it also bound him deeper to this family, to the risks of attachment. The return ride under moonlight was silent, charged with unspoken emotions. Eleanor thanked him profusely, her voice thick with relief, but Elias waved it off. Internally, he grappled with the day's impact. He'd stepped beyond his boundaries, faced the world, and survived. But doubts crept in. What if this closeness led to inevitable pain? What if history repeated, and he lost again? Eleanor seemed to sense his turmoil, reaching out to touch his arm briefly, a fleeting contact that sent warmth through him, reminding him why the risk felt worthwhile. Back at the ranch, sleep evaded Elias. He paced the cabin, memories of Rebecca flooding back not as torment, but as gentle reminders of love's worth. The next morning, Eleanor arrived with renewed energy, bearing homemade pie from her mother as thanks. They worked seamlessly, the air between them lighter, laced with tentative hope. But fate, ever capricious, had other plans. That afternoon, a rider appeared on the Horizona messenger from town with urgent news. Eleanor's father had taken a turn for the worse overnight, coughing blood and feverish. She needed to return immediately. Panic gripped Elias as Eleanor prepared to leave. He insisted on going with her, but she refused, citing the ranch's needs and his discomfort in town. The argument was brief but intense, revealing cracks in their fragile trust. Eleanor accused him of hiding behind his fears. while Elias countered that rushing headlong into danger helped no one. In the end, she departed alone, leaving Elias in a storm of worry. Hours stretched like days as he tended chores mechanically, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Had he pushed too far, too fast? Was this the loss he dreaded? Night fell heavy, and still no sign of Eleanor. Elias sat on the porch, staring at the dark path, when hoofbeats echoed in the distance. She returned exhausted, tears streaking her face. The doctor had come thanks to Elias's prior arrangement and stabilized her father. But the prognosis was grim. Months at best. Eleanor collapsed into his arms, the first full embrace in 20 years, sobbing out her fears. Elias held her awkwardly at first, then with growing surety, his own tears falling silently. In that moment, vulnerability became strength, isolation gave way to solace. The crisis forged them closer. Over the following weeks, Eleanor split time between ranch and home, with Elias providing support in ways he never imagined, delivering supplies, even visiting occasionally to help with heavy chores at the farmhouse. The town gossip shifted from suspicion to curiosity, some even nodding respectfully when he ventured in for errands. But not all was smooth. Jealous neighbors whispered about the old recluse stealing the young girl, igniting debates in saloons about propriety and age differences. Eleanor faced confrontations from well-meaning friends, questioning her choices amid her family's plight. These external pressures created internal conflicts, moments where Elias withdrew into silence, fearing he'd become a burden. One such clash erupted during a market day. Elias had accompanied Eleanor to sell milk in town, a bold step for him. As they set up the stall, a group of rough locals approached, led by a burly man who'd lost land to speculators, and blamed hermits like Thorne for hoarding resources. Words escalated to shoves, the man accusing Elias of exploiting Eleanor's desperation. Fists flew, and Elias, rusty but resilient, defended himself and her honor. Bloodied but victorious, he stood amid the chaos, realizing violence had intruded on his peace not from solitude, but from connection. Eleanor pulled him away, tending his wounds with shaking hands, her eyes flashing with anger and concern. That night, back at the ranch, they argued fiercely. She blamed his temper, he her naivety about the world's cruelty. The fight ended in tears and apologies, but it highlighted the story's core tension. Cooled love bloom amid injustice and hardship, or would it wither under pressure? As summer faded to autumn, leaves turning gold like promises unkept, Elias and Eleanor navigated these storms. Shared sunsets on the porch became rituals, where they dissected life's unfairness, disease ravaging her father, the grief that had isolated him, the societal judgments boxing them in. Eleanor challenged Elias to see beyond his guilt, arguing that Rebecca would want him to live fully. In turn, he encouraged her to dream bigger, perhaps even pursuing that herbalist path once stability returned. Their bond deepened, laced with moments of intimacy, a shared dance in the barn to imagined music, hands clasped during walks, kisses tentative under harvest moons. Each touch eroded 20 years' barriers, but also amplified fears. What if her father passed, shattering her? What if town bigotry forced choices? The turning point came with the first hard rain of the season, mirroring their initial storm. Eleanor's family home flooded partially, forcing evacuation. Without hesitation, Elias opened his ranch to them. Their siblings, and ailing father transported carefully by wagon. The cabin bustled with life, children's laughter, cooking aromas, bedside vigils. Elias adapted, his once silent world alive with chaos and warmth. He and Eleanor's mother clashed over routines. Siblings tested boundaries, but through it, unity formed. Eleanor's father, in lucid moments, thanked Elias for giving my girl hope, a blessing that healed old wounds. Yet adversity persisted. The flood drew opportunists, thieves targeting displaced farms. One night, intruders struck the barn, attempting to rustle cattle. Awakened by noise, Elias confronted them, a gunshot grazing his leg in the melee. Eleanor joined the fray, firing warning shots that scattered the bandits. The violence shook them, sparking heated discussions on injustice. Why did the vulnerable suffer while the wicked preyed? Elias saw it as life's inherent brutality, Eleanor as a call to resist. perhaps through community watches or petitions to the sheriff. Their differing views created dramatic tension. Forcing Elias to question his isolationist way that hiding from the world enabled such lawlessness. Recovery brought clarity. As her family mended and returned home repaired, Eleanor chose to stay, proposing they formalize their partnership not just in work, but life. Elias' heart mended by months of connection, accepted with a ring crafted from Rebecca's brooch, symbolizing past honoring future. The wedding was simple, attended by family and a few accepting townsfolk. But it ignited controversy. Some celebrated the miracle romance, others decried the age gap and circumstances as exploitative, fueling saloon debates on love versus desperation. In the end, as winter snows blanketed the ranch, peace settled. Elias touched not just cows, but a wife's hand, children's heads, a father-in-law's shoulder. He'd learned that while injustice and violence lurked, connections' rewards outweighed risks. Eleanor hadn't just tended his herd, she'd revived his soul. But the story continued, challenges ahead. Winter's grip tightened on the ranch like a vice, blanketing the fields in snow that sparkled under clear skies, but hid treacherous ice beneath. Elias awoke each morning to the sound of Eleanor's soft breathing beside him, a miracle he still couldn't quite believe. Their wedding had been a quiet affair in the town chapel, with her family huddled close and a handful of neighbors who'd come around to the idea of the hermit's redemption. The ring on her finger, reforged from Rebecca's old jewelry, symbolized not replacement, but continuation, a life honoring the past while embracing the future. Yet, as the days shortened, new shadows crept in, testing the bonds they'd forged. Eleanor's family had returned to their repaired home, but the flood's aftermath lingered. Crops lost meant a lean season, and her father's health ebbed like the receding waters. Elias sent what he called preserved goods, extra milk, even a portion of his savings, but it never felt enough. Eleanor divided her time, riding back and forth, her face growing lined with worry. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she confessed her guilt, torn between her new life as wife and her duty as daughter. Elias held her close, murmuring reassurances, but inwardly he wrestled with his own demons. Had he selfishly pulled her into his world, only to watch her suffer the pull of two? The first major trial came with the blizzards. Storms howled down from the mountains, piling drifts higher than a man's head and isolating the ranch for days. The cows huddled in the barn, their breath fogging the air, while Elias and Eleanor worked tirelessly to keep them fed and warm. One night, the wind rattled the cabin like an angry spirit, and a beam in the roof groaned ominously. Elias ventured out to reinforce it, but the gale knocked him down, burying him in snow. Eleanor, spotting his lantern extinguished, braved the tempest to drag him back inside. Her hands, red and raw from the cold, tended his bruises as she scolded him for recklessness. "We're in this together," she said, her voice fierce. "No more lone heroics." The incident sparked a heated debate by the hearth. Elias argued his isolation had taught self-reliance, while Eleanor countered that true strength lay in partnership. Their words grew sharp, echoing old fears of dependency leading to loss, hers of watching loved ones fade without support. The argument ended in embrace, but it left fissures, reminders that healing wasn't linear. As the snows thawed into muddy spring, external threats emerged. The bandits from the flood night hadn't forgotten their humiliation. Whispers in town spoke of a gang preying on outlying ranches, stealing livestock and tools under cover of darkness. Elias fortified the proprietor, enforcing fences, setting traps, but paranoia crept in. He patrolled at odd hours, rifle in hand, sleep becoming a stranger. Eleanor noticed the change, the way his eyes darted at shadows and confronted him. "This isn't living, Elias. It's surviving again." He snapped back, citing the violence he'd witnessed in his youth war that took friends. The accident that claimed Rebecca. "The world's full of injustice," he growled. "Better to face it armed than blind," she challenged him, drawing from her family's struggles, the disease that struck without mercy, the floods that favored no one. Violence begets more violence. Maybe we fight it by building community, not walls. Their clash escalated, voices rising until Eleanor stormed out to the barn, leaving Elias alone with his regrets. The confrontation forced reflection. That night, As Elias stared at the ceiling, memories flooded. Rebecca's final days. Her plea for him to find joy after her. Had he honored that by hiding, or by opening to Eleanor? Come morning, he apologized, proposing they host a town meeting at the ranch to discuss mutual defense against the bandits. It was a bold step, inviting outsiders onto his land, but Eleanor's eyes lit with approval. Preparations brought them closer, baking pies, clearing space in the barn, turning tension into teamwork. The gathering drew a surprising crowd: farmers, shopkeepers, even the sheriff. Stories poured out of thefts, assaults, families driven off-land by fear. Elias shared his encounter, his voice steady despite nerves. Eleanor spoke passionately about unity, how isolated suffering allowed injustice to thrive. Debates flared, some advocated vigilante justice, others legal channels. A grizzled veteran argued for arming everyone, while a young mother pleaded for nonviolent solutions like shared watches. Elias found himself mediating, drawing on his reclusive wisdom to highlight risks of escalation. By evening's end, they'd formed a loose alliance, routing patrols, signal fires for aid. As guests departed, Elias felt a shift, no longer the hermit, but a community member. Eleanor squeezed his hand, whispering, "See? Connection fights back." But peace was fleeting. Weeks later, the bandits struck again, this time at Eleanor's family home. A frantic rider brought news at dawn. Raiders had stolen horses and supplies, roughing up her brother in the process. Rage boiled in Elias as they raced to the farmhouse. Arriving to chow shattered windows, scattered belongings saw red. Eleanor's father, frail in bed, recounted the terror, while her mother bandaged the boy's cuts. Eleanor comforted the children, her face a mask of controlled fury. Elias vowed retribution, gathering neighbors for a posse. The sheriff cautioned restraint, but emotions ran high. Eleanor pulled him aside, eyes pleading, "Don't let anger consume you. We stopped them smart, not reckless." He bristled, accusing her of naivety, sparking another rift. "You've seen loss," she retorted. "Don't invite more." The argument hung heavy as the group set out, tracking footprints into the hills. The pursuit led to a tense standoff in a rocky canyon. The bandits, cornered, opened fire, bullets whizzing like angry bees. Elias dove for cover, returning shots with precision honed from lonely hunts. Chaos ensued: shouts, smoke, the acrid smell of gunpowder. One neighbor fell wounded, heightening the stakes. Elias advanced, flanking the leader, but hesitated when he saw the man's face, young, desperate, eyes wide with fear. Memories flashed at his own youth, driven to edges by hardship. Instead of firing, he called for surrender, promising fair trial. The bandit wavered, then dropped his weapon, others following. The capture was bloodless from there, but the violence left scars, the wounded man's groans, the bandits' tales of poverty pushing them to crime. Back home, as the sheriff hauled away the prisoners, Elias and Eleanor reconciled under starlit skies. He admitted her wisdom-blind vengeance would have perpetuated the cycle. She confessed her fear of losing him to old shadows. They discussed the deeper injustices, economic woes breeding desperation, lack of support for the poor. "We can't fix it all," Elias said, "but we start here." Eleanor nodded, suggesting they advocate for community aid programs, perhaps a cooperative for shared resources. Spring bloomed into summer, bringing renewal. Eleanor's father rallied briefly, long enough to see his daughter thriving. Elias expanded the dairy, hiring help from town young men down on luck, teaching them skills while providing fair wages. The ranch buzzed with activity, children from Eleanor's family visiting often, filling the air with laughter. Yet challenges persisted. A drought parched the land, testing the alliance. Neighbors argued over water rights, old grudges surfacing. Elias and Eleanor mediated, organizing equitable sharing that averted conflict. One heated meeting turned physical, a shove leading to fisticuffs, but Elias intervened, de-escalating with words on unity's fragility. The incident sparked town-wide talks on violence's roots, how scarcity fueled aggression. Injustice thrived in division. Personal trials deepened their bond. Eleanor discovered she was with child, joy tempered by anxiety given her family's health history. Elias fretted endlessly, hovering like a mother hen, which led to light-hearted spats. "I'm not fragile," she'd tease, but he'd counter with tales of Rebecca's complications, revealing lingering fears. They navigated it together, consulting the doctor, preparing the cabin for a new life. The pregnancy brought Eleanor closer to her mother, shared wisdom bridging generations. As autumn harvests yielded bounty, a final crisis loomed. Word came of a corrupt land baron buying up debts, evicting families including Eleanor's. The man, ruthless and connected, used strong-arm tactics to intimidate. Elias rallied the community, uncovering evidence of fraud through collective sleuthing. Tensions peaked at a confrontation in town square, the baron's hired guns facing off against farmers. Words flew like daggers, a punch thrown igniting brawl. Elias shielded Eleanor, taking a blow meant for her, blood trickling from his brow. Chaos reigned until the sheriff, bolstered by petitions, arrested the baron for extortion. The victory was hard-won, exposing systemic injustice power imbalances, allowing the wealthy to prey on the weak. In the aftermath, as bruises healed and land secured, Elias and Eleanor reflected on their journey. From solitary milking to communal triumphs, they'd transformed isolation into interconnection. The birth of their son in winter's thaw symbolized hope, a child raised in love, free from the fears that once bound his father. Years passed in relative peace, the ranch prospering as a hub of fairness. Elias, no longer touched only by necessity, embraced family, friends, community. Violence and injustice persisted in the world, but they'd learned to combat them with resilience, empathy, action. Eleanor hadn't just asked to milk cows, she'd ignited a life of purpose, proving that even after decades of solitude, redemption awaited those brave enough to connect. What do you think about the themes of violence and injustice in this story and in real life? Share your opinions in the comments below. Do you believe community is the key to fighting back? Or does individual strength matter more? Take a stand and express your views. I'd love to hear them.